Now, as a few of you may know, I have a bit of a history on here when it comes to Japanese wrestling. I absolutely love it after all. It's a passion as big as gaming or music or anything else, especially the good old days of the 1990s. It is a passion that's even got me into some trouble. Being a big fan of the old Puro, I've naturally tried to recreate it in many of the wrestling games I've played over the years. Everything from making edits of my favourites, folks like Kawada, Misawa and Jushin Liger, in my favourite WWE games, to playing games from Japan itself. Who cares if I don't speak the language? Most of the time it doesn't matter and I have loads of fun anyway. There's one particular series, Spike's Fire Pro Wrestling, that I've spent, well, thousands of hours with. I've done videos on it and everything. It's the greatest wrestling game series ever. But today, I thought I'd do something different. Fire Pro isn't the only Japanese wrestling series out there. There's plenty more. And there's some pretty damn good ones as well as others that perhaps are a bit more weird. So that's what we're doing today. We're looking at a bunch of pro-risk games that aren't Fire Pro. Also be sure to watch this vid to the finish, because I have a very special and awesome announcement about the future when it comes to my wrestling documentaries. But before that, let's go. I thought I would take this chronologically, and what better place to start than the platform where Fire Pro actually began? There wouldn't be a Fire Pro if it wasn't for the good old PC Engine, or TurboGrafx 16 if you're American. The late great Human Entertainment set the ball rolling in 1989, and those consequences haven't been the same since. So I wondered if there was a Japanese-only Fire Pro alternative even at this quite early stage. In the end I didn't find one, although I did find two weird games that are examples of, well, a very Japanese style of game, I suppose. Hell, I'm almost including them out of curiosity, and to see if anyone in the comments can see the appeal of such things. Here then is Maniac Pro Wrestling Asu Ino Tatakai from Hudson Soft. It appears that in this game you play as someone who's in training to become a wrestler. The game tells their story. There's a lot of cutscenes and a lot of text, meaning that this is quite the adventure. The actual wrestling itself though, that's something I don't really get. You move around each other, and then when you clash you just select a move. A big flashy animation plays out, all very anime and so on, and then the whole process just sort of repeats. There's not exactly much struggle. It never seemed like I could reverse moves or anything, or that there was much risk involved in just picking whatever move I wanted. Kind of odd. Perhaps I would find a harder challenge if I'd played further, but, well, all this flash and pizzazz just seems to hide a game that's basically just bloody menu selection. There's another game kinda similar to this on the system, Monster Pro Wrestling. As you might expect, this game doesn't actually feature actual wrestlers, it features big old monsters. However, that doesn't mean we get some arcadey King of the Monsters style action. Instead, again, we get to choose from a bunch of moves. There is a slight element of risk this time. You get a dice roll, and most of the time whoever has the higher number pulls off the move. But that's it. Again, there's tons of very impressive looking cutscenes for just about every move, but in the end, it's a dice roll. There seems to be a lot of these sorts of games around that never made it out of Japan, more than just wrestling ones. I'd hesitate to say that they're bad games as such, they're just games I don't get. What was the appeal of them? Is it the adventure and the storytelling? Is it the training aspect and the other things outside of the in-ring action? I'm not sure. I leave it to the comments to hopefully elucidate, or at least call me a twat. In the meantime, here's a bit more action. We go to the Sega Mega Drive for a wrestling game that's entirely populated by Joshi wrestlers, meaning women of course. For those who don't know, Joshi Porcelain has at various times been massively popular, with ludicrously talented wrestlers to boot, as good as anyone you care to name. And so there are a couple of games that are totally based around Joshi. Like this one, Cutie Suzuki no Inside Angel, a game by Asmic from 1990. Cutie Suzuki was at the time a very popular wrestler in the JWP promotion who also did a bit of crossover into music and films, and while she wasn't ever exactly the greatest of wrestlers, it makes sense for her to get a game given her popularity. Indeed, Cutie Suzuki is the sole real star of this game. The other wrestlers are fictional, although as is often the case they're based off real life stars. You can perhaps pick out folks based on the likes of Dump Matsumoto, Devil Masami or the Crush Girls if you've watched your fair share of Joshi. The main mode here has you take a wrestler through various knockout cups and tournaments, all the way through to the Grand Championship, so long as you've got the time and inclination to get that far anyways. And will you? Well, it's a so-so game. The main difference you tend to find between Japanese and Western wrestling games is that grapples are usually decided through timing as opposed to button mashing, although this is sort of in the middle on that front. Honestly, mashing seems to be the best approach a lot of the time. In any case, you can pretty much spam strikes and submissions on your opponents, which sap tons of energy and can make the game kind of easy. The graphics are fine, as is the general presentation, including a commentary team that often consists of either Asmik's dinosaur mascot or the frickin' Terminator, and there's nice animations and so forth, but playing it does kinda get old quickly. Alas, there's just not a whole lot out there for Japanese wrestling on the Mega Drive. The coolest thing about this game, in fact, is the cover. Look at it, it's lenticular. Cutie Suzuki changes her pose depending on the light. How cool is that? Well, not very cool, I suppose. Still, there's not many lenticular Mega Drive covers out there, so that's a bit unique. In the 16-bit era, when it came to Japanese wrestling games, the SNES ruled the roost without question. Obviously it was where Fire Pro made its home, but there were plenty of other games besides that, including some really good ones. Hence why 4 of the 10 games here are off the SNES, and only one of them is crap. Let's get that one out of the way first. Tenryu Genichiro no Pro Wrestling Revolution by JWP. It's a game based around the independent war promotion, which stands for Wrestle and Romance by the way, and indeed it's named after the promotion's founder and main star, the legendary Genichiro Tenryu. Tenryu is one of my absolute favourite wrestlers, so naturally I had high hopes for a game based around him. Alas, these hopes were dashed immediately. This is sort of like those strange PC Engine games we saw earlier, only the action is a bit more involved. There are actual strikes and moves you can do in the traditional way, as well as a timing based grapple system, but there's also big fancy cutscenes on the top and bottom for each wrestler. So it's a hybrid in other words. And it really doesn't work. It doesn't matter how good the cutscenes are because the in-ring action is so bloody small. And all they really do is distract from playing the friggin' thing, which in any case is so slow and unresponsive. This game, quite simply, does not work. The idea should have been cast into the bin at birth, but it wasn't, and here's the lousy result. Amazingly, it's the only game of these 10 that actually saw Western shores. It got a release internationally as Hammerlock Wrestling. The game does actually have a few fans here and there, but I have to be honest and say that I just don't see it. JWP thankfully fared a lot better with another title, and it's the return of Joshi Puro. We have more than just Cutie Suzuki this time. In fact, it's not just her, it's her home promotion. Presenting JWP Joshi Pro Wrestling Puro Wrestle Queens. Join Cutie Suzuki along with a collection of JWP's top stars. Dynamite Kansai, Mayumi Ozaki, Kandi Yokotsu, Hikari Fukuoka. If you were watching back in the day, these gals walled. You can enter big old tournaments featuring all these folks, along with the regular options of single, tag and all of that. You generally find Japanese wrestling games to be a bit thinner on the ground than American ones in this department, particularly in the 90s, and unless it was a deathmatch promotion, most companies didn't run many gimmick matches involving ladders or tables or whatever. Still, the action makes up for it. Pure Wrestle Queens is a decent game all told. Thankfully, the silly cutscenes of the last game are gone in favour of a properly sized display. You can actually see what's going on, which I think we can all agree is a massive improvement. The grappling is a lot better throughout. It's easier to pick out when you should actually press the button on a lockup in order to time the button press, and the system also allows for plenty of reversals. If you look closely, you can see wrestlers flash whenever they can reverse, and you can get a pretty good chain going. These wrestlers all look really bloody good too. Properly proportioned and detailed, they're as good a 16-bit recreation of an actual wrestler as you'll find. This definitely redeems Jalico after the previous fiasco, and it's worth checking out for sure. A shame that this didn't make it to Western Shores while bloody Hammerlock Wrestling did for some reason. All of this said, it's no surprise to find out that a lot of other Japanese wrestling games were, well, heavily influenced by Fire Pro. It was quite a popular series after all, loved for the simple system and of course the huge roster that gave a pretty good overview of world wrestling at the time. Why bother with just 12 or so wrestlers when you can have 100 or more? Others wanted a piece of that pie too, and so they'd make games that were pretty definitely inspired by Human's classic. But that doesn't mean they're no good. Indeed, the two we've got here are crackers. The first one, Jikyo Power Pro Wrestling 96 Max Voltage, is an attempt by Konami to get a bit of that Fire Pro magic going. You may notice quickly that this certainly looks a lot different to what we've seen so far. I mean, all the sprites are rotoscoped. You don't get many other games that look like this, certainly on the SNES, all the go-odd shading and that. It's not too surprising perhaps, seeing as this is a pretty late title and folks like Konami might want to flex their muscles a little bit. I have to say though that I do prefer more simple sprites to what we have here. Even though their movement is really fluid, that's no substitute for war speed. That said, there's a lot to enjoy here. We've got commentary throughout for one thing, and a cool roster. While there's not quite as many wrestlers as Fire Pro, a whole division of the roster is made up entirely of classic Konami characters, interpreted in wrestler form. You've got Bill and Lance from Contra, you've got Richter Belmont, there's even an attempt at wrestlifying a Vic Viper from Gradius. There aren't exactly many other wrestling games that try to do something like this. In fact, I can't think of any whatsoever. This inspired touch alone makes Power Pro Wrestling at the very least certainly worth having a curious look at. Still, of all the attempts to try and outdo Fire Pro at its own game, there is one that for my money comes really close. It's not quite up to the level of a Super Fire Pro Wrestling X Premium, but it could happily fit in. Here's Gekitou Burnin' Pro Wrestling, a game by Bulletproof Software. That is indeed the same studio that was run by Henk Rogers and played a big part in the wranglings for Tetris. But here's another reason to know them. As you could probably surmise purely from the game's name, this is as close a clone to Fire Pro as you're going to get. You've got a whole load of wrestlers with the names changed around a bit, but all pretty recognisable to anyone who follows purettes. You've got guys from the big leagues, New Japan and All Japan, guys from independent promotions such as FMW and Michinoku Pro, a division that's basically a WWF WCW hybrid, as well as fighters from early MMA shoot wrestling promotions like Pancrase, UWFI and RINS. The action plays exactly like Fire Pro. You have weak, medium and strong strikes and grapples, and your best bet is to start with the weak moves and just work your way up. You initiate a grapple by bumping into each other, time your button press for just after a particular and very noticeable frame of animation, and hopefully you do your move. This system, in its own way, tends to produce something that even if it is played competitively, reproduces the structure and flow of an actual pro wrestling match. It's so very Fire Pro. The only major difference in look, quite frankly, is that the ring has been rotated 45 degrees from where it usually is in Humans games. And yet, damn it if it doesn't play superbly. The animations are almost as good and as satisfying as the best of SNES Fire Pro, which is actually saying a hell of a lot. The speed is most certainly there, fast and intense, but not giving up that proper match structure. There's some different modes to play with when it comes to doing a bit more than just having exhibition bouts, and coolest of all, you can, if you want, choose to play as the referee. It's not like Special Referee in SmackDown where you can happily play as Steve Austin and just dish out stunners to everyone on a whim. You are limited to purely reffing actions like counting falls, asking wrestlers if they give up, or holding the illegal man back. And if you do that for too long, well, you'll get laid out with a punch. This is a fun little gimmick indeed. It certainly adds a different dimension to what I usually do in a Fire Pro game, which is just sit back and let the CPU do its thing. Overall, this is fantastic. As derivative of Fire Pro as the game might be, it does an excellent job of trying to take on the kin. Highly recommended. Now, what about the 32-bit systems, specifically the PlayStation and Nintendo 64? Now, as we all know, back in the 90s, the discerning PS1 user could mostly lord it over those poor Nintendo 64 folk. Look at all of these RPGs, listen to that crisp and clear audio, check out this massive library of gems. But of course, there is that one area where the N64 can point at the PS1 and laugh, and that is wrestling games. It wasn't even close. The N64 had the almighty AKI, WWF and WCW games, and the PS1 did not. It had WWF Warzone and Attitude. The later arrival of SmackDown was the only thing that slightly redressed the balance, but even then, yeah, still N64. With this in mind, let's ask the question, does this massive gap in quality carry over to Japan? Well, the PS1 did have Fire Pro G, of course, just as the Saturn had 6-Man Scramble and the Dreamcast had Fire Pro D. All of this generation's platforms had a Fire Pro game except the N64. But as those are out of the question, let's go for this instead. Shin Nihon Pro Wrestling Tukon Wetsuden 3, developed by a name that will be quite familiar. Good old Yuke's, later of SmackDown fame. As the name suggests, this game is entirely based around New Japan pro wrestling folk, with a full roster of stars: Chono, Muta, Liger, Hashimoto, and of course, Inoki. You can't not have the big chin. Tukon Wetsuden is a fair bit different and a little more considered than Yuke's later WWF game. If you've played Power Move Pro Wrestling on PS1, you've played a westernised version of the first instalment, and this third one is much the same but certainly cleaned up a fair bit. I always enjoyed Power Move as early a game as that was. In the main, it just felt really nice to play with, very satisfying moves, and this does too. It's certainly nice to play a version of this game where you don't have to play as, I don't know, Kinog, or the Commandant, or any other rather stupidly named wrestler. It's not a massive leap from the original game that I'm more familiar with, of course. In the main, it's just considerably nicer in the presentation department. The sort of thing that you would like to see evolve further through the generations. Now, for the most part, this wouldn't happen, as Yuke's got the big WWF contract, and SmackDown was quite a bit different from this. There is a fourth Tukon Wetsuden game that's Dreamcast only, which is actually quite a bit more like SmackDown. You can almost think of that as the bridge between the two series. And hey, the Dreamcast is also where you can play the pretty good Sega arcade conversion that is Giant Graham 2000. And when you look at what's on the N64, you understand that absolutely none of this even matters one frickin' iota. This video, considering its subject matter, has to feature at least one all-time classic of a game, even if it's one that's pretty well known. As any wrestling fan with an N64 knows, the AKI games are kin, mainly WCW NWO Revenge, WrestleMania 2000, and of course, WWF No Mercy. I would say that as far as actually playing a wrestling game goes, they are the best by a long way. Speaking as someone who generally just sims on Fire Pro, although that is my favourite, if I had to pick just one game to actually play, it's AKI, every time. And AKI's brilliant work reached its peak on the N64 for Japanese audiences, the best of an all-time great series. I am, of course, talking about Virtual Pro Wrestling 2 Udo Keishu. As big a Fire Pro fan as I am, if someone was to say that this was the greatest wrestling game ever made, I'd find it kind of tricky to actually disagree with them. So what makes VPW 2? You get a great roster, of course, one that captures a certain time. It's an All Japan licensed game from 2000, one that came out mere months before the big split. So what you have here roster-wise is kinda like the end of an era. Misawa, Kobashi, Vader, Taue, Akiyama. Not long after this game, none of these guys would be part of All Japan anymore. It's awesome on that front, even without also having unofficial representations of not just big stars from other companies and legends, but also MMA fighters. One of the big differences between this and the Aki WWF games is the MMA fighting mode, something that was totally excised from games like No Mercy. Sometimes the MMA mode in games like this can feel a bit tacked on, but the one in VPW2 is actually quite in depth and certainly no slouch. Hell, this was one of the best MMA games around for a long time, at least until studios actually got serious about the sport. Still, it says wrestling on the marquee, and that's what you come to this game for. And this has the best wrestling action. If you've played something like No Mercy already, you kinda know how good it is. The utterly satisfying, lovingly crafted animation, the momentum system and how matches just ebb and flow, all packed in with controls that are very simple indeed to just pick up and play. Even if you barely play games at all, you could be having fun with these games in minutes. But here, where the classic Aki gameplay tries to emulate the Kins Road All Japan style, geez, it's just even better somehow. It's not just No Mercy with a Puro reskin. There's very noticeable differences in how the games play. There's a bigger focus on strikes, particularly with the introduction of lengthy combinations. Generally speaking, matches here take a longer time to finish than they would in No Mercy, just as they would in Kins Road matches. There's even the emulation of fighting spirit, moments where you hit a big move like say a head drop suplex, but then all of a sudden your opponent gets back up and does the same to you with his last gasp of energy. Things like that just never get old. I mean, this game as a whole will never age. Even if it's been a couple of years since I last played it, I can always just fall back into it so easily. It takes no time at all for me to stick two legends in the ring, get involved in an epic struggle that I never once had to try and artificially engineer, and fall in love all over again. What a freaking game this is. And lastly, we're going to the PlayStation 2 for our final duo. It feels appropriate to end here, on the platform where I got my first proper introduction to Fire Pro. Fire Pro Returns, a game that happily took a large chunk of my life. That and, well, the PS2 is the last platform where we saw any particularly decent number of Puro games, as the mid-late 2000s general decline of wrestling in Japan meant that there's barely been any wrestling games at all since then. But on the PS2, the Puro fan wasn't just limited to mucking about with 2D sprites in Fire Pro for a good game. Hell, if you wanted a very Fire Pro-esque experience, only with 3D, you could always have a go at Spike's excellent King of Colosseum 2. But I'm not going to cover that today. Instead, let's start off with, of all things, a wrestling game by Square Enix. Not necessarily a company you would associate with wrestling, eh? But here we are, and here's AllStar Pro Wrestling 3 from 2003. Square's AllStar Pro Wrestling series had started out pretty bare bones and, on the whole, not very good. It's quite surprising that it took until this third and indeed final instalment for the game to actually include an edit mode, for example. But now, well, we've got a fair few modes, and plenty of wrestlers too. As we go into the PS2 era, it's now common for games to get licenses from multiple promotions, as opposed to sticking with just one, meaning that ASPW 3 features real wrestlers from New Japan, Pro Wrestling Noah, and 01, along with a bunch of freelancers. ASPW 3 fixes a bunch of problems the previous games had, and then some, and the end result is actually pretty spectacular. No one talks about this game too much nowadays, but they really should. First off, it's amazing looks-wise for PS2. Probably the best looking wrestling game up to that point, and certainly the best looking Japanese one. The entrances, for example, are freaking epic, especially in the Tokyo Dome, and the action and the models, they're pretty good too. The play is simple enough. Generally it should be familiar to most in that you have to play the game like you're working a proper match, starting with weaker moves and gradually building up to stronger ones, but there's other things to pay attention to. The rush meter, for example, which fills up as you get beaten on and allows you to make a really strong comeback. But where this game really shines is in all the little details. It feels like a labour of love that seemingly tries to emulate all the best things about Puro, all of its little quirks, from the big stand and the strike exchanges, to the all-time great moments, in quite unique ways. For example, it's possible, as seen in the intro, to do Misawa's terrifying tiger suplex off the ramp to Kenta Kobashi, one of the most famous moments in any pro wrestling match. But it's not something you just set for any wrestler in the edit suite. It can only be done if Misawa himself is facing Kobashi, and only under certain very exact conditions. That's the level we're on with this one. It feels like the people behind this adored wrestling so much and wanted to get everything in that they could, and the end result is actually freaking awesome. Kind of unknown these days, but absolutely one you should play. We don't necessarily end with the best game in the video, but it's kind of right that we end with Wrestle Kingdom by Yuke's. This came out in 2006, and outside of a PS2 only sequel, it was basically the last Puro game we would see for a very long time. No surprise there, as Puro was starting to hit some pretty lean years, unfortunately. It's appropriate then that just about everyone comes to the Wrestle Kingdom party. The big three promotions, New Japan, All Japan and Noah, are all here, as well as big freelancers and legends. It's a pretty interesting roster. It should be noted that the PS2 version of Wrestle Kingdom is the only non-WWE game where you can play as a certain beast incarnate Brock Lesnar, immortalising his disastrous IWGP Championship run for all eternity. Being that this is a Yuke's game, you may well be familiar with how this plays already, especially if you've played any of the GameCube Day of Reckoning games. As such, this is a bit looser when it comes to flowing like a wrestling match. The action tends to be speedier here than it is in other games we've seen, and you're able to get to a finisher pretty quickly. Still, you do generally have to start with weak moves, and there's a bit of momentum too. This isn't quite SmackDown where you can throw the big bombs right from the off. On the whole, it's okay. It certainly looks a bit drab when you compare it to something like ASPW 3, but it's perfectly serviceable in the looks department. The general quality and care of things may be a little disappointing. For some it may feel like some awkward middle game that isn't totally an imitation of Puro, but it isn't much like a WWE game either. But there's lots of potential here. Wrestle Kingdom has the building blocks for what, like ASPW 3, could have ended up being a bloody good game. But alas, it's a shame that thanks to the general state of Puro at the time, it never got much of a chance to evolve into such a game. And so, there you have it. Now, I did say that I had a big announcement to make, so here goes. In the summer of last year, I had an amazing time creating documentaries about Japanese wrestling. People absolutely loved them, I loved making them, it was special. But then sadly I had to stop. Japanese TV companies struck and I very nearly lost my whole channel. I had 2 strikes at one point. As much as I wanted to, the vids just couldn't continue here on YouTube. That said, I didn't want them to fully go away, and judging by all the messages that I still get, nor did anyone else. And so, they're back. On Patreon. Misawa, Lesnar, and others are there right now. Not only that, there will be new Puro documentary videos. 1 each month to be precise, exclusive to Patreon. By doing this, it's possible for me to keep this awesome thing going. So, I hope you join me there to experience some awesome vids about one of the best damn things in the world, pro wrestling. But I hope you've enjoyed this vid on some classics from the world of pro res games. There's a load more out there, so perhaps there could be a sequel someday. We shall see. Bye for now. If you like this video, please do like it, please do have a look at my social media, particularly my Twitter, that's where I'm most active. And also, if you want things like ad-free content, exclusive posts and old wrestling documentaries and new ones in the future, have a look at my Patreon. You could join this list of awesome people here. Alexa Jones-Gonzalez, Andrew Dalton, Andy Cat, Arcade Loai Webmaster, Asobi Kwan DX, Brian Henniger, Chris Conrad Pritchard, D. Xalior, Rimwan Sutter, Dave Cork, David Rose, Dinty76538, Dustin Cooper, Gary Samaden, Geordie Alex, Gluntheth, Ian Roberts, James Brown, Jason Stevens, Jace Alexander, Jeff Ladd, Matthias Gramzov, Martin Potaki, Potter Margel, Renbimon, Rusty Kelly, Seth Robinson, Simon Gulliver, Stuart Christopher Brownlee, Tariq Amir, Le Geeky Dad, Tim Wald, Yerpa Operator, and to all the rest of the awesome community, thank you so much, goodbye and take care.